Good evening. I'm Charles Duffy, and this is Political Pulse. Tonight, it's our privilege to have Mark Shields, who's, is a TV pundit and also a writer. Mark, thanks so much for coming.
Happy to be with you, Charles. Thank you.
Before you were on TV pundit and a writer for The Post and other places, you were actually involved in many interesting campaigns. And I kind of wanted to talk about some of those campaigns tonight, if I could, Mark. And the first one I want to talk about is the Robert Kennedy campaign. And I know in '68 he was assassinated after the California primary, but you were working on his campaigns out there in the West, Nebraska, Oregon, and I wonder what your memories were about that time. And
oh well, I mean, it was 1968, of course, and it was a year that for those who didn't live through it is almost impossible to imagine. I think it's a year. It's fair to say the nation had a nervous breakdown. The war in Vietnam raged. The resistance to it at home grew. President Johnson was challenged for renomination first by Senator Eugene McCarthy and then by Robert Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy of New York. We had the assassination of Martin Luther King, and more than 100 American cities went up in flames after that. We had the riots at the Chicago Convention, of course, after nominating Vice President Humphrey, and that was after Senator Kennedy's assassination. But I mean, Robert Kennedy, to me, represents a lot that is unique in American politics, unique from his brother, unique from the rest of the political landscape and cast of characters. He, for one thing, he was the last tough liberal. I mean, there was a toughness about him. I mean, in part because of his prosecutorial experience as the Justice Department, but sort of a no-nonsense and roll up the sleeves, and if we have to settle this outside, we'll settle it outside if necessary. And yet tempered by a remarkable compassion that he that I think grew later in his life, probably in part because of the assassination of his brother, to whom he was so close. But he really became the voice for the voiceless, and it was interesting. I mean, big business and big labor both opposed Robert Kennedy in 1968.
what was it like do you ever think back to those days? And I know he lost Oregon to Eugene McCarthy.
He did,
But
that's
what
right.
were those last days? And then he flew into California.
Right.
He won that, and then late at night at the Ambassador Hotel after he spoke, of course, he was assassinated in the kitchen. But do you remember back to those 2 or 3 or 4 days and just do you ever think about them?
Oh, sure. No, I'd been in Nebraska for 6 weeks, I guess, and Robert Kennedy won Nebraska handily, 53%, and then was on to Oregon and went to Oregon, where I was, organizing for him, and we lost Oregon, Oregon was a state with very few problems, and Robert Kennedy was a candidate who appealed to those who had problems or felt the nation had problems. There was a certain complacency about Oregon, and he was the first Kennedy ever to suffer a political defeat. And he quoted Abraham Lincoln, who said of the man being run out of town on a rail in a small Illinois town, if it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd just as soon pass on it, because he'd been the first person to run out of town on the rail, first person to lose primary. We knew California was big casino. I mean, we went to California. I was responsible for the Get Out the Vote effort in Northern California, San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, and that whole area, the Bay Area. And, we knew that was it. I mean, but Charles, it's impossible by today's measurement, whether for Senator Kerry or President Bush or whatever, to imagine the intensity and the excitement of the crowds. I mean, Robert Kennedy, obviously this is before his assassination, the security was not there. I mean, there wasn't this intervening Secret Service or police protection. So the candidate was very exposed to crowds. And I mean, I can recall in May of that year, his flying into Columbus to meet with the Ohio delegation, because at that point we didn't have primaries. The state parties or the state chairman, the governor, picked delegations to go to the conventions. That was changed as a consequence of the 1968 primary experience and the nominating experience. And he flew in, and it took him 2.5 hours to get from the airport in Columbus, Ohio, downtown, because the streets were lined with people who just wanted to see him, to touch him. And it was just remarkable. And that was especially true in those last days in California.
And I'm sure the assassination hit you hard, but you after his assassination, Hubert Humphrey, of course, became the nominee for the Democrats. But do you think Robert Kennedy would have got the nomination, and do you think he would have beat Richard Nixon in '68?
I do think he would have gotten the nomination. I think it would have been tough. That night is something that hasn't been written about much. Mayor Richard J. Daley of Chicago, who controlled the Illinois delegation, called Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, who was still, who lay really inert. He was a victim of a stroke. But he called him to tell him that he would be with his son. He was going to support Robert Kennedy. And Daley's support would have been enormously, enormously important. And the plan then was to go on and to challenge Vice President Humphrey, who was the choice of the party, the party regulars, the people who made the decisions in the party, and to just challenge him, go to every city he went to, outdraw him in crowds, and to leave the rather stark choice. I think he would have won the nomination. I'm not sure, but I think he would have. And I think Richard Nixon, who was a fragile personality, faced with the prospect of running against a second Kennedy in 8 years, and somebody who wasn't carrying the baggage of the Vietnam policies that had become so controversial and so unpopular, and were such a real disability for Vice President Humphrey in the fall of 1968, I think Robert Kennedy would have won.
And you talk about serendipity or things like that, but how, if Robert Kennedy would have made it through the primary and then the general election, how different the country would have been run those years, and just think about how it would be different. I don't know if, but there's other examples of serendipity. I know you worked on a little known candidate, now little known, but a guy named Jack Gilligan, who was, you worked on his '68 Senate race in Ohio, and then his
after the Kennedy assassination,
and then his
That's
1970
right.
governor's race. And I read Jack Germain's book recently, and he thought that Gilligan was presidential timber. And but in '74 he lost by 11,000 votes, and then he might have been the Democratic nominee in '70.
Yeah, that's right. No, he was a very special man. In fact, he was a remarkable man, Jack Gilligan. And he won the governorship in 1970. Actually on a platform of an income tax in a state where the bill had never been introduced in the legislature. It was considered the third rail of politics, and he got it passed, and it was put on a referendum to repeal it in 1972 when George McGovern was the Democratic nominee, and losing Ohio by 1 million votes. And they were able to beat the repeal of the income tax in that kind of an environment handily. But in 1974 he did lose re-election to former governor and then future governor Jim Rhodes, a very formidable Republican campaigner. And I think there's no question he would have been a national possibility in 1976 and beyond. It's a tough business.
It's a tough business.
It's a tough business.
Another campaign you were involved with was the Edmund Muskie run for president, and he was, I think when he died, you called him one of the last great senators. And I mean, he was a giant of a man, a governor, senator of Maine, secretary of state, but many people don't remember that, but remember how his campaign ended, which was he was, a couple of stories were in the Manchester Union Leader. One was a hoax and the other attacked his wife, and he basically cried in defending his wife. And many people remember that as opposed to the other stuff.
It's interesting. It didn't actually end the campaign, but it did. It was just before the New Hampshire primary in 1972, and one of our most ardent supporters, who was in a leadership role in New Hampshire, had made the mistake of saying that the victory New Hampshire would be 50%. That expected that Senator Muskie would get 50% of the vote in a multi-candidate primary field. And the problem, Charles, was that he won with 46%,
Wow.
10% over Senator McGovern, but the press read it as a setback because this artificial bar had been set by one of our own people. But that said, your description is absolutely right. Senator Muskie, the Manchester Union Leader, which is a conservative newspaper, but then was a really vitriolic rag. It was run by a man named William Loeb, who was a hate merchant. I mean, he used to run front page editorials, attacking not just Democrats. Kissinger the Kike was one of his front page editorials, and Rocky the Wife Swapper, and just scorching, scalding attacks. We did one, and Muskie was used to criticism, having been governor and a senator, as you pointed out, for many years, at that point for 18 years. But this was a criticism of Mrs. Muskie, and a suggestion that Mrs. Muskie, was a woman who smoked and drank and so forth. And Sarah Muskie went to the steps of the Union Leader newspaper, and there was Saturday afternoon, there was snow coming down, and there was moisture everywhere. We can argue whether he cried or not, but he certainly was emotional, and he did choke up in defending his wife. That became sort of the symbolic signature of the campaign.
But why would that, and just thinking back, we're all flawed, we're all imperfect, but why would that be a negative in people's minds?
Well, it's interesting. This is before American culture changed, to some degree. Big boys weren't supposed to cry then. This was before Phil Donahue, before Alan Alda, before sort of the sensitive male came along, and you'd be able to show your feelings and you show your emotions. And somebody said to me, if it had happened, just 10 years later, Muskie would have been applauded and commended as a man who cared deeply about his family and was not afraid to show emotion. But in that time, in that context, it was somehow seen, if not a case of maybe not weakness, but is this a stable person?
And then after the Muskie campaign, you were, I guess, the political director for Sergeant Shriver, who was the vice presidential candidate on the McGovern-Shriver ticket.
That's right.
And one thing that's interesting about that race to me is that McGovern was a huge war hero. He flew dangerous missions over Germany, won the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I know that Nixon was attacking him for being weak on defense and being a dove. And I know that you urged the campaign to, hey, bring this out. You were a huge hero at 22 years old. And
well, it's interesting. You're right. In 1970, when John Gilligan had been running for governor of Ohio, he had been seen as a liberal Democrat, rightly so, in Cincinnati, which is a very conservative town. And we knew they were going to come after us in these terms. And Jack Gilligan had been a naval officer who won the Silver Star. And his ship in the Pacific was attacked by a kamikaze plane, and Gilligan was given credit by many of his shipmates for saving their lives and really saving the ship, because he got the ammunition out of the ammunition dump in time before the entire ship exploded. So we went back and found a couple of his shipmates who talked about him, who was still living in Ohio, as a matter of fact, and talked about him and his bravery in a totally non-political way, so that people would have a sense of this man's character, and the charges would be, would go ahead. I'm sorry.
We just need to take a break, and then
Sure.
we're going to come right back.
Absolutely.
And I want you to get back on that
Okay.
story. But we're going to take a break. We'll be right back with Mark Shields. Thank you.
Lewis and Clark, great explorers. Hey, wait. Hi, I'm Thomas Jefferson. Would you check out the West for me? Oh, sure.
And they take their keelboat up the Missouri.
Oh, Buffalo.
Then they built Fort Mandan. They're at 1804.
Made some friends along the way. I'm Secretary West.
Through the Columbia Gorge.
There are tons of ways to help with your kids' learning. Find the really good ones on connectforkids.org.
The sweet Pacific Ocean. Yeah!
We're back with Mark Shields. And Mark, you were talking about the Gilligan campaign.
That's right, McGovern, Shriver, and the Gilligan. Well, as I mentioned, in the Gilligan campaign, Gilligan had been a hero, and we just told that story through his shipmates. Then remember one fellow, Slim Heinzelman, was a butcher, and he said, "I'll tell you about what John Gilligan did that day, saved my life, and that's the kind of toughness we need." in Columbus right now as governor. Well, that had been the case with George McGovern. I mean, George McGovern had been, your description is absolutely accurate, Charles, an authentic hero. And there was a resistance because the bombing of North Vietnam and the bombing of much of the rest of Vietnam had become sort of a moral issue in the campaign, especially among the anti-war folks supporting George McGovern, that there was a resistance, a reluctance, a denial that any offensive military action could be moral. And George McGovern, the story of George McGovern could have been told, as it was later told so well and so effectively by Stephen Ambrose in the book about George McGovern's heroism. I mean, George McGovern, I mean, did incredible things. I mean, he brought in his plane with the engines missing on a runway, only one half the length required to land the plane he was flying at the time, riddled with the gunshots, and the folks didn't, his own crew didn't think they would make it through, and said, but for him and his courage, his strength, and his stamina, they never would have done so. But the McGovern campaign high command somehow just resisted that, and I think they made a mistake.
And I know in '76 you worked with the campaign for Morris Udall, Udall,
yes.
Congressman from Arizona.
Just a wonderful man.
And I know you think highly of him. And I wrote down a quote that you said about him: "A gentle giant with steel in his soul and without 1 ounce of pomposity." And he came in second 7 times to Jimmy Carter in that campaign. But what were your recollection of
Well,
that?
he was just he was a marvelous man, and probably as emotionally healthy a candidate as I've ever known. I mean, there wasn't the necessary self-importance, I think. I mean, Mo Udall was never able to persuade himself that if he didn't win, the Western world would collapse. And that's I don't say it's a sine qua non to be a presidential candidate, but it helps to believe that you are the only answer. But he was just one of the things I recall. We were talking about people running again, because in '76 the question of Vice President Humphrey was going to get back into the race, and he'd run for the first time in '60, and of course he'd run in '68, and he'd run in '72, and there was a question he was going to run again in '76, and he said well, you have to understand, Mark, the only known cure for the presidential virus is embalming fluid. I mean, in other words, once it seizes anybody, and there's some truth to it, once somebody gets that White House fever, I don't care who they are and how noble their cause, it doesn't leave their system very easily.
Well, I know, and I read that in Wisconsin the night before he was declared the winner, but the overnight it
right.
changed, and he lost that race, and he came out and said, "Hey, remember that speech I gave last night? All the places where I said win, put lose in there."
That's right. Yeah, he did. Yeah, and he also quoted one California Democrat who, upon losing a primary, said, "The people have spoken, the bastards."
But you work with some huge giants of the political world, and Muskie and Udall, Robert Kennedy, and you just look out there today, and I'm not so sure that you can see people like that out there, and I don't know why. I mean, maybe you could reflect.
Well, I think part of it's perspective too. I mean, I think great events bring out the best in all of us, and great times and great tests. I think our politics is not as perhaps conducive to that as it was. I mean, there's an equal division. This is a tight division. There's an acrimony that probably wasn't there. It certainly wasn't as pronounced then. I mean, although feelings ran high and campaigns were tough, and maybe it's just the perspective of time. I mean, we may look back, or children may look back 20 years from now and say, boy, weren't they something? Wasn't that George W. Bush something? Wasn't John F. Kerry something? They may, perhaps, we see them up close with, their warts and their imperfections, and their smirks, their aloofness, or whatever it is that preoccupies us. But, I don't know. I mean, at the tail end of the 19th century, we had a series of pretty mediocre, from the, prior to the Civil War and after the Civil War, there were some pretty mediocre types that held high office, and the giants. The giants are few in the human race. We're not a human race of giants, I guess, which probably is good.
How about the? I thought maybe it has to do with the advent of cable TV. There's so many stations, and back in those days, I mean, these guys got together in the back room, and maybe they were more apt to do things for common good because, they weren't out there. They weren't out there, and they have to face the O'Reilly factor and have Ann Coulter write a book about them, and perhaps they could get together and.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, and I hadn't thought of it that way. And they have a different constituency now. One thing that changed it, and I'm convinced of this, was the Watergate Vietnam experience became a discrediting experience for politics, the consequence of it, that people could now seek public office and high public office by running against politics, by running against government.
I see.
So instead of somebody coming back to the hometown and say, look, this is what I'm able to do for our hometown, our home state, or the nation, the premium became, Charles, I'm going down to Washington, I'm going to be different from everybody else there. And I think your point about cable television is a good one, because that enables me to get sort of political payoff by going on and attacking my fellow politicians, because I'm going to get airtime. It doesn't make me effective within the legislature, within the Congress, doesn't make me effective as a public policymaker, but it does get me, perhaps my ego boosted, and it gets me the kind of coverage and maybe potentially the kind of larger political influence I'm seeking.
Now, George Bush, the senior, ran a campaign where he says, I want to have a kinder and gentler America, but at the same time, the late Lee Atwater, of course, was running the whole Willie Horton thing, and which really tore apart the Dukakis campaign. None of those guys you work with, the Muskies, the Gilligans, the RFKs, I mean, they would have never ran a campaign like that.
I hope not, but I think after the, it's interesting, as soon as that campaign was over in 1988, the campaign you're referring to, when George H.W. Bush defeated Michael Dukakis it was a pretty brutal campaign, and raised questions about Dukakis' patriotism and as well as his concern about public safety and indulgence of rapist murderers and Willie Horton. As soon as the campaign was over, he said, the first thing he said was, the campaign's over, I don't want to talk about it anymore. In other words, that was, because he wanted to, he was not obviously proud of that campaign that was run, and it was, I don't think, reflective of, who he was most of the time. So it was not a campaign in which he took great pride.
I told you before the interview, I go up to New Hampshire every 4 years, and I go to the town meetings for the Republican candidates, the Democratic candidates, and some memories stick out of my mind, and one of them is John McCain standing on the steps of the town hall in Bedford, New Hampshire, the night before. It was almost like a picture out of Life magazine. And I also remember watching on TV an amazing memory, which was Livingston, Bob Livingston, the Speaker elect in 1998, when he said, I'm not going to stand as the Speaker because he had an extramarital affair.
Yes.
That was, it was just a shocking memory for me. But I'm sure that you have many. Is there any vivid memories that stick out as you think back on your political career? Something that kind of just sticks with you that you remember, just as being vivid.
Yeah. Well, I guess the California primary in 1968 for Robert Kennedy, there's a flood of visions. I came by our headquarters on Sunday morning. He did just before
RFK.
Robert Kennedy did, yeah, just before we were organizing our Get Out the Vote, and the intensity, the emotion, the hope, the excitement of those crowds. I mean, all reaching out. I mean, so many different hands from so many different faces. And I remember that. I remember that vividly. I remember, I remember Senator Muskie. For a man of just incredible strength, and I think great vision. I mean, there'd never been an environmental law written in the United States until Ed Muskie came to the Congress.
Wow.
I mean, it was just, he was the first person. I remember Mo Udall and the absolutely wonderful humor and the closing night of our campaign in Ohio when, we had the press had a great affection, put on a little party for him. And, he came in and, was typically self-deprecating. And, and a couple of reporters come up to me and said, we've never covered anybody we liked as much as Mo Udall. And I can remember that I remember John McCain vividly in that 2000 campaign, covering it in New Hampshire. I can remember people asking John McCain, when are we going to get Patients' Bill of Rights? And John McCain answering it, as long as my party is controlled by the insurance companies and the other party is controlled by the trial lawyers, we're not going to have Patients' Bill of Rights. And you'd see people kind of, because usually politicians didn't couch things a lot more diplomatically than that. I mean, they didn't, they always said the other party was controlled by special interests. They never talked about the interest of, the influence of special interest in their own party. And I found the McCain campaign in 2000, and especially in the South Carolina campaign, where he was savaged by tactics very similar to that 1988 campaign that the Bush folks had used against Dukakis were used against McCain in 2000 in South Carolina.
It's still amazing to me that McCain's a big supporter of the president after what happened down there in South Carolina.
Yes, it is.
I
think that comes back to, in part, to Mo Udall's aphorism that the only known cure for the presidential virus is embalming fluid. I don't think John McCain has ruled out a 2008 attempt.
And clearly you love politics, and I was just curious, did you ever think about throwing your hat in at some time yourself?
Well,
we have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, sure. No, did I ever think? I did at one point. I thought about going back to Massachusetts. There was an opening in a House seat to my home, but at that point, I'd cast my lot here. I enjoyed it. I'd started a family here, and every once in a while you wonder what kind of a candidate you would be, but you do realize that the toughest job in the campaign, in any campaign, is that of candidate, and it's the candidate who has to tolerate the fools and take the slurs and realizes the dislocation and inconvenience to his own family, the separation time and so forth. All the bands and the balloons and the bunting don't compensate for that. And I do respect the people who care enough to run.
We're going to get you on your way. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. No, it's been fun.
No, you're very busy.
Thanks so much.
And thanks everybody for joining us tonight on Political Pulse. We'll see you next week.
I can cause sudden headaches, dizziness, trouble walking, talking, seeing. What am I? I am a stroke. Learn to recognize a stroke.
Here's the 2-1.
Hi, I'm Barry Bonds for RAD, recording artists, actors, and athletes against drunk driving. In my league, we hit home runs without a designated hitter. But if you want to get home safe, there should always be a designated driver. So when you're with someone who is drinking, take their keys. Call a cab or drive them home yourself. Because friends don't let friends drive drunk.